I want you to think about something for a second. What if the most powerful force in the entire universe isn't what we've been told it is? Today, we're going to dig into a really powerful sermon by a guy named Daniel Lamptey. And he makes this pretty bold claim that there's a power out there that's way bigger than miracles, bigger than any spiritual gift. And honestly, it might just change how you think about strength altogether.
So, where does he start? Well, Daniel Lamptey builds his entire argument around this one single question from the Bible. It's really the launch pad for his whole idea. He uses it to dive deep into what he calls the love of Christ, and to argue that, look, there is literally nothing in the universe that can stand up against.
And he doesn't waste any time. Right out of the gate, he lays out his core idea with this really bold statement. He says, the most powerful force, it's not what a lot of people in his tradition might focus on. It's not the spiritual gifts or the big miracles, what he calls the anointing. Nope, he argues it's something way, way more fundamental than that. Okay, so what is this supreme force he's talking about? To really get us to understand what makes it so different, so unique, Daniel Lamptey kicks things off by drawing a really important line in the sand between two kinds of divine power. And this is where it gets interesting. He frames it like this. On one hand, you've got the anointing. Think of that as the spiritual gifts, the abilities, basically the power that flows from God. But then there's the love of Christ. And Lamptey says, that's not just the flow. That's the source. It's the foundation, the bedrock. It's where all that other power even comes from in the first place.
But he doesn't stop there. He actually takes it a step further. Lamptey's argument is that if you try to define God with any other name, you're actually limiting him. He says love is the only word, the only concept that's big enough to capture who God is in his entirety. So get this, in his view, love isn't just something God does, it's who God is. It's his very nature.
So that leads to a pretty big question, right? If this love is so incredibly powerful, what was its greatest demonstration? I mean, what's the ultimate proof? And according to Daniel Lamptey, the answer is probably not what you're thinking. In fact, it's a point that some might even find a little controversial. This is where Lamptey makes a really provocative claim. He says the ultimate number one act of love was not Jesus dying on the cross. He actually believes the greatest sacrifice took place way before that ever happened. And here's how he breaks down his reasoning. For Lamptey, the real sacrifice wasn't just one moment in time. It was this huge, incredible journey downward. It was the choice to leave a place of ultimate power, of total glory, and to willingly become one of his own creations. And not just any creation, to become a tiny, helpless, completely dependent human being.
To help us wrap our heads around just how massive this was, Daniel Lamptey uses this incredible analogy. He says it's like a human deciding to become an ant and live among ants. I mean, can you even imagine that choice to go from divinity down to not just a human, but a vulnerable one? For him, that's the most profound, powerful expression of love you could possibly think.
Okay, so that's the big idea, the theory. But what does it look like in action? How does this love actually work in the real world? Well, Lamptey argues that you see its true power not in these huge, flashy gestures, but when it comes into contact with really flawed people, right at their lowest, absolute worst moments. And his prime example? The story of Judas. I mean, think about this. At the exact moment of the ultimate betrayal, as Judas is literally handing him over to his enemies with a kiss, what's Jesus' response? It's not anger. It's not condemnation. Lamptey points out that he looks at him and calls him friend. To him, this shows a love that's totally unshakable, totally steadfast. It doesn't matter what the other person does.
Then he brings up Peter, right? The guy who, to save his own skin, denied even knowing Jesus, not once, but 3 times. So after the resurrection, you'd think Peter's in for a serious talking to. But Lamptey points out that's not what happens at all. Instead, Jesus finds him on a beach, cooks him breakfast, and just feeds him. For Lamptey, this is everything. It shows that this love is all about restoring, about rebuilding that connection, not about punishing someone for their failures.
Now, this is the crucial point he's making. These acts, calling Judas friend, making Peter breakfast, they aren't just sweet, sentimental moments. No. Daniel Lamptey says these demonstrations of love are the very source, the engine of real world-changing power. According to Lamptey, this kind of love is literally the fuel for any of that other spiritual power, for that anointing we talked about. It's the force that can break down a person's pride, that can soften a hard heart in a way that he says even a miracle can't touch. It's not just about showing off power, it's about humbling people. And like we saw with Peter, it's what inspires that kind of deep, lifelong devotion.
So what is the nature of this love then? Lamptey uses a great metaphor here. He compares it to an ocean. Think about it. You can't drain the ocean. You just can't. He explains that, yeah, our actions can create distance, and they definitely have consequences, but they can never, ever deplete the source. On God's end of things, he argues, that love is always there. It's infinite, and it never changes.
And this all builds up to what might be his most sobering point of all. Daniel Lamptey suggests that when it all comes down to it, the final measure of a person's life, it's not going to be about how much power they had or how many miracles they performed. He interprets that final judgment as boiling down to one single crucial question. Did you walk in this kind of love?
So after all that, Daniel Lamptey's message leaves us with this one last, really provocative thought to chew on. If the greatest force in the universe isn't about control, it's not about might, but it's this self-sacrificing, unchanging love, well, what does that do to our own ideas about strength? How does that completely flip the script on what it means to be truly powerful?